Merit is considered to be racist, to be unfair. Why has the word merit fallen on hard times?
It returns the emphasis to the individual, to how they think about their place in the world and plan for it, which the social justice warriors don't want any emphasis on the individual. They don't want the emphasis to be on the state, the government, not even the sort of the church or the social organization, but actually the sort of coercive political power that they would like to see brought into play.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTigg of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. As always, let's start with prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Almighty God, through the intercession of St. Ignatius Loyola, we ask that you pour forth your Holy Spirit upon us, a spirit of discernment, they might hear your voice and obey your command. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, friends, we have our headquarters in Buffalo. We can practically see Canada from our front porch. Canada's a great neighbor, and we got a lot of listeners there, especially in the Toronto area. And I'm scratching my head. Well, I want to have a show today called Canada versus the Church. My returning guest is an expert guest. He's a Canadian Catholic author. He hosts the Kennedy Report for the Fatima Center and is starting up a new radio program on the Crusader channel. Kennedy Hall, welcome back to the Catholic Current.
Thanks for having me back.
Kennedy, I grew up as kind of a typical American. I had a vague awareness that Canada was up there, and people seemed to be nice, and they wore sweaters, and they did a lot of things with hockey and snow, and they were all just pretty agreeable. And then in recent years, apparently Canada has brain fever. There seems to be wokeism and anti-Western civilization and anti-Christianity with a degree of momentum and an absence of resistance that confuses me as an American. What's going on up there?
Well, we're going through a period of, I actually wrote an article for LifeSite the other day, and it's called Canada, a Lethal Combination of Systemic and Societal Anti-Christian Sentiment. It's a mouthful, but what's happening is we're seeing the fruits of Marxism in Canada fully. I have a pet theory that we sort of see these battles between the Marxist and Freemasonic elitists because they're kind of the same but kind of different, and we don't really have we don't have a counterpoint to the Marxism in Canada. It's kind of baked into the cake here, even in the Constitution. In fact, Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, who was pray that he had a deathbed conversion. Let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. But he made the Charter of Rights and Freedoms under his government, which is supposed to be sort of something like a Bill of Rights for us. But it baked into it is this idea that you can have exceptions to your rights if the government deems it reasonable. It's very much a Soviet-style tactic. You see that in the writings of Solzhenitsyn about the different laws they would pass, which could justify any sort of persecution. So when things get politically incorrect or when political correctness begs the government to act in a certain way, then they have all the tools to do so. And we have all of these same, secular, sinful promotion of vice and all that stuff that you see everywhere. But there aren't any legal protections. That's the main issue. I imagine that in blue states and blue cities and red states and stuff in America, and probably in some red states, I would imagine you do see the same pushing of immorality in all the spheres we know. However, there are legal protections. For Christians. Those don't exist here. So basically, we're just seeing, if you can imagine all the Antifa, BLM, Joe Biden sentiment, it's sort of like imagine there wasn't checks and balances. That's kind of what's happening here. So we're not, generally speaking, very violent in Canada. So fortunately, we're having churches burning now. That's something we'll talk about later. But
right.
So it sort of happens slowly. It happens sneakily. It happens kind of quietly. And then before you know it, it's like you're the frog who's been boiled in the warm water and you don't really realize you're dying. So that's what's happening right now. And there's lots more I could say about it, but there's probably other questions you can ask as well.
Okay. I know that the Canadian government has responded to what I call the COVID interruption, what I think they see as the COVID opportunity, with very significant elan. And in particular, apparently the primary super spreader sites throughout Canada are small churches. And this is where we need lots of armed men harassing pastors and so on. I'm sure you heard the terrible story about Pastor Artur Pawlowski, and we're going to link to our friend Sarah Corrier's interview with him. Why the particular animus against the churches in Canada?
Well, what's interesting about that situation is that Alberta is the most freedom-loving conservative province we have, and they did today. Actually, today's Canada Day, so happy Canada Day to my fellow Canadians. Dominion Day used to be called.
Mm-hmm.
Alberta is dropping every single one of their restrictions today, so they're kind of like Florida or Texas now. They're just completely open. So it's a strange paradox that happened in Alberta because Alberta is known for the sort of freedom-loving, but there's a schizophrenic reality to Canadian government. So even in a place like Alberta, very freedom-loving, which is the reason you had those pastors doing it, because they are rugged, freedom-loving types. Hence why that's the province where everyone stood up to the government. But on the other hand, the public health powers from various sneaky government mismanagement, they have an absurd amount of power. So the premier there, Jason Kenney, who ironically, under Stephen Harper, our former conservative prime minister, he was actually the head of religious freedom. If you can imagine that. He did. I mean, listen, he did not technically send the guards there. The various regions and municipalities did that. So it would have been a local police force under the health, whatever. Nonetheless, he himself is quite conservative, all things considered. However, the health authorities operate almost like a shadow government. So that's kind of the schizophrenic nature of Canadian governance, is that there's sort of two regulatory arms. And during this pandemic, so-called, there have been these emergency acts enacted, and basically that gives the health authorities something like legislative and police powers. So we've seen that, and there really has been an anti-Christian animus, though, especially in places like British Columbia, where they have a very leftist government. They have the New Democrat Party. They'd be something like the left wing of the Democrats. And but weirdly, it's a very outdoorsy, it's BC, it's granola, it's hippies, it's that sort of thing. Except in the interior where they're quite rugged. But anyway, sorry, they were having things open. Like you could play hockey, you could play, you go camping, you could do all the outdoorsy stuff. You could do, go to gyms and things, but they just had an interdict essentially against churches opening for like 4 months. It was the longest one in Canada, even though they had the least amount of deaths. It's very strange. And then where I live in Ontario, it's been the worst of them as far as shutdowns go. We're in stage 2 now, it's called. And where my church is located, we're allowed to have 15% capacity. But luckily, my priests we're just doing, you can have as many as you want outdoors, and they have a football field attached to the school. So we got full capacity masses every Sunday, and the weather's always, I swear God stops the rain for like an hour and 11 minutes, and then it starts before and after mass. So that's what we've been doing. So it's that's a strange situation, to say the least.
Friends, I'm speaking with Kennedy Hall. He's calling in from Canada. He hosts the Kennedy Report for the Fatima Center. Kennedy, I also see every now and again, Archbishop so-and-so says, no mass for you, or, aren't vaccines great? And again, look, I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I see, when I went to travel in Southeast Asia, I got 17 inoculations. I will simply say I'm waiting for the results to come in regarding the necessity, safety, and effectiveness of the COVID vaccines. But it seems that where the church and state are in harmony is that we need to be in a continued state of panic about COVID in Canada. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, well, we're seeing the fruits of let's call it materialism. Fear not he who can kill the body, but fear he who can kill the soul. And the reaction. I go to a traditional parish, okay? And so our priests, not that Novus Ordo priests, but I'm just saying, generally speaking, broad strokes, there tends to be a more fervent devotion to the dogmas and the traditional orders and whatnot. And that's just kind of what we see. So, friends of mine who go to the Diocesan Novus Ordo thing, when the pandemic hit, it was basically shut her down, right? Whereas our priests kept going for 2 or 3 weeks after, until finally the government said no gatherings, whatever, whatsoever. But we went to mass. This was back in a year and a half ago, and they weren't making fun of the fact that there was a pandemic over, but they were trying to make light of it. So we walked in, and it said, for the health of your body, perhaps try to use hand sanitizer. For the health of your soul, make sure you go to confession. The emphasis was, listen, you might die. Right. So if you're going to die, you should probably be at church, and you should probably go to confession.
Right.
That's kind of the point. And whereas with the general consensus amongst the bishops has been health of the body is first and foremost. stories I've heard, like they canceled baptisms in my diocese, baptisms. And it got to the point where, tragic story of a friend of mine, I won't tell it, but I'll tell you, it was by the grace of God, they were able to get their child baptized. Not because the church said so, but because the government had opened up on a fluke, and it was a life-saving baptism. So, or soul-saving baptism. So anyway, it's been very strange and materialism in the belief, but I would also say, just from a natural perspective, the bishops have some ceremonial role over the Catholic school system in Ontario, which is publicly funded, and there's this sort of weird relationship, and they get a ton of money. So it's been sort of a follow the money situation, I think, and a lot of them were almost bankrupt from abuse settlements, whereas they've got tons of relief payments throughout coronavirus.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Kennedy Hall of the Kennedy Report for the Fatima Center and a new radio program on the Crusader channel. We're talking about church versus state in Canada. The next time, we're going to talk about why our Canadian church is burning. Remember, our rallying cry here at the Catholic Current is Christus Mundo Mundus Christo, bringing Christ to the world and the world to Christ. We do it because our Lord says so, for the greater glory of God, the love of our neighbor, and the salvation of our own soul. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Everything you need to take this conversation to your family and friends, we give to you. Together, we'll take it around the world. We'll be right back. Please do stay with us. This is Jesuit Father Robert McTague, your daily host of the Catholic Current. Join me at 5 p.m. Eastern for something different. We'll be starting the show with an occasional feature called Let's Talk About This. On Friday, I'll be offering a rebuttal to a Washington Post editorial criticizing the Church's teaching on Holy Communion. We'll follow that up with a conversation with another great guest and wrap it up with your favorite feature, Weekend Readiness. That's Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern on the Catholic Current, coming to you from the Station of the Cross and the iCatholic Radio mobile app.
You're listening to the Catholic Current with Father Robert McTague from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Stay connected with the show, our guests and topics, by following the show on Twitter and Gab. Just search for The Catholic Current.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTague of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us on the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. My returning guest today is Kennedy Hall, is a Canadian Catholic author, hosts the Kennedy Report for the Fatima Center, and has a new radio program called The Kennedy Profession on the Crusader channel, which is animated by our friend Mike Church. We're talking about Canada, church versus state. Kennedy, what's going on with churches burning in Canada?
Yeah.
I know why churches are burning in France. Why are they burning in Canada?
Well, I got to give a little background here. It's a very sensitive issue in Canadian history. So on the one hand, I want to say truthful things, but on the other hand, I don't want to seem like I'm, let's say, passing over important things to be insensitive. So we have a contentious history in some parts of Canada with we call, Native Canadian, First Nations, Aboriginal, Indian, whatever term you've heard. Mm-hmm. And right now we call them First Nations. That's the politically correct term. So that's what I'll use. And so there was these things called residential schools. Basically, there was a similar program in the States. They just called them boarding schools or Indian boarding schools or something. And basically, they were assimilation schools. It was a government program, and they had the church and Protestant churches run most of them. And now, the Catholic thing is interesting, though, because there was already a network of Catholic missionary boarding schools around the country. So they sort of started giving them funding and saying, you do our program. Mm-hmm. In many cases, it was quite positive. If anyone wants to know more about this, I would recommend going to LifeSite and just sort of Google in their search bar there, residential schools. They have some really good information. And a lot of it was positive. It was, the Oblates of Mary and the Jesuits and all these old orders that basically evangelized Canada. and they were wonderful places. The students would go there. They'd learn English or French. They were up in remote communities, so it was a school and they wouldn't have otherwise had one. They were catechized. Their souls were saved, God willing, and so forth. Problem is, the government, being an English government, I'm an Anglophile, but I must admit that there is a Freemasonic eugenics-minded aspect to the colonial ideas of the English. Mm-hmm. And there was this idea that they had to do something like ethnic cleansing if they could get their hands on them. So in some of the places, the policies got to the point where they were quite immoral. So they would do things like, for the longest time, the schools were voluntary and parents would gladly send their kids to Catholic schools because they were free, for the families, which was the only way that the natives could be educated because of how remote they were and they didn't have money and so forth. But then it became, well, if you don't send your kids there, we're going to come take them from you anyway, which is wrong, which is completely wrong.
Sure.
So that obviously the church found itself in a position where I talked to a priest about this and he said, well, as far as I can tell, we know that that's wrong, but our mentality was the kids are going to be sent somewhere anyway. There's no salvation outside the church. Therefore, let us stay open for those who are forced to come here. At least they'll get a Catholic education and we'll do the best job we can. To be honest, it's a very reasonable position if that's what you're dealing with, in my opinion. However, over time, at some of the schools, there was abuse in the same way we saw with the Christian Brothers and things like that in Ireland, which there is no excuse for, and the fullest extent of the law and the powers of justice should be leveled against those who are abusers. I believe that 100%.
Okay.
So this has made, as things have got more politically correct here in Canada, this has left a bad taste in people's mouth. There was a committee called the Truth and Reconciliation Committee that happened, or commission, sorry, that happened over about 10 years, ended in 2015. It was a wonderful thing. The church leaders, the Aboriginal leaders, they got together, they went to Rome, they talked to the Pope, they talked to the bishops. There was apologies. It was amazing. Like, it really was reconciliation. It's all you can hope for. It was, hey, this bad stuff happened. We love you. We're sorry. No excuse. And the natives leaders said, wow, we're so happy you did that. It was all you could ever hope for. Okay. Well, Justin Trudeau is trying to stoke a race war because he's a Linskyite. He's a Marxist. That's what he's doing to the country. So there were these grave sites, and this is all known. This is previous information, came out in 2015, but there are grave sites that don't have grave markings where the burial plots are. Mm-hmm. So this has turned into a narrative of 215 children discovered, no grave sites. The Catholic Church committed genocide. That's the narrative right now. Or they're calling them mass graves, where a mass grave is actually technically that's not what a mass grave is. This is a site. Right. Now there's an explanation for this. The information for the anthropologists that looked into this years ago, it's actually the fault of the government because the government would not pay for funeral costs and the government would not pay for transportation of the bodies. And often these schools were a 25 to 30 hour trip away from where the families lived. Oh. And they didn't have ways to contact. A lot of the dads were trappers, for example. They didn't have phones. Mm-hmm. Tuberculosis, Spanish flu. Unfortunately, these things would happen. And the government was actually known to pull an Andrew Cuomo, and they actually sent kids to the schools who already had TB. Oh. Just classic evil government mismanagement. And the church is now being blamed for all of it. So the reason why they don't have any markers on the graves is because they use wooden crosses with their names on them. Mm-hmm. Now, because they were poor, the schools were poor. Over time, the crosses basically deteriorated and the land changed hands, and whoever owns it now, because it's actually on native land, they never put the tombstones up to signify. So it's being used almost like a rabbit in a hat pull out a trick right now, where Justin Trudeau is calling on the Pope to personally apologize, even though Benedict already did that in 2009. All of this reconciliation happened under the last Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who was a good conservative, so they can't acknowledge that it actually happened. Mm-hmm. And now the sort of Black Lives Matter mentality, we don't have the African-American history, but we have obviously the Native history. So that sort of critical race theory mentality has seeped its way through the schools. And now there are churches burning on Native reserves. So they're actually burning down Indigenous churches, which is so counterproductive. Mm-hmm. And you can tell that it's organized because of the way that the churches are burning down. It's actually very hard to burn a building down. To start a fire like that, you have to be basically a professional. So it's sort of like those U-Haul trucks full of rioters showing up last year around Trump's campaign. Uh-huh. And that's basically what's happening. I just saw news that another one is burning down now in the Northwest Territories. So they're going to all the Western and Northern communities. And the Prime Minister is stoking the fire. And he himself, God save his soul, because he is essentially a public apostate at this point. And he is promoting the destruction of his own ancestry. And it's quite sad.
The this I feel like I've walked into the middle of a very long story, and I want to tread lightly because I really am operating from ignorance, and certainly, I mean, this is a tragic, painful story. I'm glad to hear there were glimmers of hope, that there were genuine efforts, and it seems on your account successful efforts at true reconciliation and true healing. Is it fair to say that what's taking place now, though, is a choice to tear up old wounds,
Yes.
and try to get some traction against Christians? Is it fair to say that?
That's exactly what's happening right now. Justin Trudeau's government is acting almost like a tin pot banana republic dictator. They're passing laws in the middle of the night and so forth, and it's very strange. So, and Parliament goes on vacation this week. They don't work in the summer.
It must be
it's
nice.
Too much for them. Yeah. It's too much for them. It's very stressful to make all that money and go home on do Zoom calls for a year and a half.
Those Canadian hot summers are legendary. So
they are. I mean, we have 2 seasons in Canada. We have winter and bugs. That's what we have. And so there's a lot of the coronavirus narrative is falling apart. There's actually, we are such a puppet state in so many ways of the CCP out of China right now that there actually is links between like selling Ebola to Wuhan. It's out of Winnipeg. It's just so crazy. So this is all under the Trudeau watch, and they're trying to cover it up. So they're using all of these race war things, the classic leftist talking points, because what's going to happen is the word on the street is they're going to call a snap election in the fall. For my American friends, you can call elections whenever you want in a parliament. It's different than the presidential system. So they're going to call an election right after the summer, after they've stoked a summer of rioting and anti-Catholic bigotry and burning down churches. They'll create the problem, and then they'll come in with some sort of sweeping plan to sort of have unity. And when there is an election, parliamentary proceedings are suspended, which means any of the investigations against him are on the table. When the new parliament is sworn in, then the old investigations are swept away and have to be brought up again. It's basically like having a judicial reset. So that's basically what he's doing right now. He is, again, whether he's an idiot or not, he is a really good actor, and whoever is pulling the strings, they are trained Marxists, and they are running the country right to the letter of the law as far as Karl Marx was concerned.
This is such a painful story to hear, and who to say, I have indignation for Native peoples, therefore I'm going to burn down their churches. That seems to be counterintuitive. I think it's safe to say that. Is there anyone in church leadership in Canada who's trying to call shenanigans on this and say, "Hey, wait a minute, this isn't ringing true. There's something doesn't smell right." Is anyone making that kind of noise at all?
I have seen a couple offhand statements from some priests. The problem is. Lots of problems, but it's such a the only kind of bishop who would be able to stand up to something like this is going to be an Athanasius. Like you'd have to be. I mean, you'd have Bishop Schneider or Strickland or someone who really has some cojones. Let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. Cardinal Collins out of Toronto is good on doctrine, but he does not poke the bear when it comes to societal things. He just doesn't. Mm-hmm. So no bishop in Canada, and actually one of the best bishops is actually up in the Northwest Territories. That's probably why they sent him there. But he's actually quite good, and I watched him do a talk once, and he was talking about the devout Marian devotion of the Native peoples up there, and it was very beautiful. So he should be heard in this. But anyway, it's there's no one who's really in that position to do it. The Alberta bishops are half decent. They're a little bit conservative out there, but the problem is that if you defend even this, if the wrong person were to hear me saying these things, may I be called a racist? I mean, I may as well be, asking for Jim Crow or something. And even though we didn't have that here, that would be the narrative about it. So it's political suicide. And at a time when the church is acting more like a political party than shepherds, unfortunately, it's a lose-lose. So the only people speaking up right now are politicians. And there are a couple. Jason Kenney, who's the Alberta premier, he went to this site, and one of the positives coming out of this is the Marxists, they're pushing it too far. Let's put it that way. Normal people are going, wait a second, I'm not a fan of Catholicism because they're homophobes or whatever, However, burning down churches doesn't really seem productive to me, you know?
Right.
So that might be one of the solace pieces of the parts of solace we can take out of this, is that they're just pushing it too far. Normal people are going, okay, wait a sec, this is insane. Especially because they're burning them down on native property, which many natives are devout Catholics. Your patrimony in the Jesuit order.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're talking about stories of saints and heroes through the Great Lakes region and stuff. The Franciscans as well. There's an amazing Catholic patrimony amongst First Nations people. The Métis tribe is essentially a French-Canadian tribe of devout Catholics. So it's harming them a lot as well. But this is the same as in America with, you harm the black people in order to get the black vote somehow. And same idea.
Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Canadian Catholic author Kennedy Hall of the Kennedy Report and the Kennedy Profession on the Crusader Channel. In the next segment, we're going to talk about hate speech and evangelization. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcasts. Wherever you can find audio, you can find us. Download, follow on the channel, write a 5-star review. We need to attract the attention of the algorithm so these conversations get the attention they deserve. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Stay with us.
This is The Catholic Current from the Station of the Cross Catholic Media Network. Catch up on an episode you've missed or share them with your family or friends. The Catholic Current is podcasted wherever you enjoy listening. Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTague of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross Studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. Our topic today is Canada, Church versus State. Our returning guest is Kennedy Hall, Canadian Catholic author, hosts the Kennedy Report for the Fatima Center, and he has a new program, The Kennedy Profession, on the Crusader Channel. I've been looking at some headlines that there are new hate speech laws coming online in Canada. I don't know how the legislative process works in Canada. They're talking about dramatic fines for public thought crimes. What's going on there?
Yeah, so to give qualification for people, hate speech laws already exist in Canada. What they're doing is they're applying those same stipulations to social media communication. So already you could be charged with hate speech for speaking in certain ways in various settings, but it hasn't been applied to electronic communication as of yet, which I'm actually surprised at, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that being said, I know if it bleeds, it leads on the, sort of the news cycle.
Right.
The shock jocks are saying, Orwell is there in Canada and stuff. Let me tell you this. To get to the level where you would have to be charged with hate speech under the laws, you would already be kicked off social media. The actual social media censorship is 50 times more sensitive than the actual law. In order to get charged with hate speech in Canada, I believe there have only been, if I'm not mistaken, like 50 cases that were actually even brought to the point where they got to the court in the whole country. And like 23 or 24 of them were for the same person. It was like a group going after some sort of right-wing guy, and it was like an LGBT group. So it was like, it's really been a handful of cases. And I don't think any of them have actually stuck. In order to nab somebody on hate speech, they would have to do something, to be honest, where I would be fine with the fact they'd be criminally charged. It would basically be something like planning some sort of lynching, and doing it in a public setting. It literally says in the legislation, disdain for a group or persons does not count. Criticism for a group or person does not count. Okay. Even hateful sentiment towards a group or person that count. It has to be, you're basically trying to plan the final solution, and you're talking about it on air.
Okay. So a real practical arranging of grotesque violence.
Inciting actual violence with, yeah.
Okay.
And even then, you could be an idiot kid saying, let's go kill all of those people or something. And if it can be shown that you're being an idiot, it wouldn't count, which is the most cases. Okay. What the problem with it is, though, is that it creates an atmosphere of political correctness to the extreme. So employers, schools, hospitals, whatever, anywhere where the government has their hands in it, they go, we have to be the furthest thing from hate speech in order to not be hate speechers.
Okay.
So it's more of the, again, it's Marxism. It's creating a narrative. It's more of planting the intellectual seeds of, to be a good law-abiding Canadian, you better police the things that your neighbor says. And that's actually the part that's worse than the legal.
Yes, I think, I know when the COVID interruption was at its height, major metropolitan areas had, social channels and special hotlines where you could denounce your neighbor for gathering in groups or not wearing a mask or whatever the violation was. And I said, that's the kind of thing that made East Germans miserable for so many decades, where you don't know who's going to turn on you. And then it just could be to your advantage. In the U.S. they have the term, swatted. So I can call up and say, hello, SWAT team, Kennedy Hall is shooting his wife. You better get over there. And then they come in with the helicopters and the battering rams, and you're just feeding your goldfish and minding your own business. So it seems to me that there's going to be a move towards a self-censorship. And that and you know what? I don't like it that the government thinks that it gets to define what is hateful. I mean, what you've described says, all right, so sure, the kinds of things you can be charged with, you need to deserve to be charged with. And the dials are always going to stay at that setting forever. Are you willing to make that commitment that this hasn't opened a door that should be closed?
Yeah. Again, that's the fear, is the precedent. The fear is the precedent, but I do have to say I haven't seen it happen.
Okay.
The worst part is the atmosphere. I was sitting in an assembly once with some students, and they were doing one of the local police officers or something. She came in. She was from some department that handled cyberbullying and all that kind of stuff. So she was talking to the students and then starting to go on about, be careful what you say online because of hate speech. Well, she didn't define it. She didn't say how hard it was to get charged, so on and so forth. So you get to this point where these kids believe that, if you say something in the Quran is not true, that's hate speech. Or, that sort of, it gets to the point where, in the way that they're raised is, things that are harmful to people must be hate speech. That's kind of the idea. And I've been accused of hate speech before. As a teacher by a colleague, for saying things like, baptism is necessary, all things considered, in order to be saved. And I was accused of hate speech for that. And I remember talking to the person and going, do you know what hate speech is? I was just, is the catechism now hate speech? Well, if you were to read some of the verses from Leviticus and on a town public square in Toronto, people would probably accuse you for that. That being said, it still wouldn't count for the law, but it's more of the sentiment that matters.
Right. Yeah. And it seems to me that this move regarding hate speech, et cetera, is moving us in the direction of, you have a right to never be offended.
That's right.
And I remember reading Voltaire's Candide, and I was offended, but the offense was at such a high level of artistry. I had to give it credit. So I'm not interested in silencing people, but it confuses me. On the one hand, you don't want to, celebrate child pornography, and so there's a place for censorship. I think blasphemy is a very terrible thing, but anti-blasphemy laws have been used to vilify Christians by self-identified misunderstanders of the religion of peace, or so I've been told. Where might this go, and how are Christians to respond? I think of, St. Paul said, let love be genuine, hate what is evil, hold fast to what is good. That seems important to me. Yeah. Are you going to be able to do that in Canada for much longer?
You know what? You just have to be smart. Like, what I mean is, listen, there's a lot of things that I would like to say, and I might say them to my friends in private conversations, but I'm not going to say them in public. Just because it's not useful, it's not helpful. I'm not going to reach someone who's far away from the church from a public perspective by going on about things that are politically incorrect to the nth degree. It's just not going to happen. So in my opinion, the way that you skirt around the backlash as best as you possibly can is to take the approach of trying to explain things through the lens of the natural law.
Okay.
And you talk to people in terms of what constitutes something that's thriving for them and something that goes against their thriving. That makes sense. Almost like logical terms.
Right.
And I find when you do that, I mean, you can talk about sexuality if you're doing it in that way. I've had great experience with this as a teacher, as a writer, and so forth. And people who would never otherwise listen to you, they'll listen to you. So again, to the point where you'd actually have to get charged with hate speech, you'd have to be a complete and utter moron and be saying the craziest things possible in public. So do yourself a favor and don't even approach that level, and instead try to, in the truest sense, not in the sense of excusing sin, but in the sense of trying to make a true connection, meet people where they are intellectually, use terms they understand, build a relationship, and then from there you have those more difficult conversations in private. That's how the faith has always been spread.
Yeah. Friends, I'm speaking with Kennedy Hall. He's a Canadian Catholic author. He hosts the Kennedy Report for the Fatima Center and a new radio program, The Kennedy Profession, on the Crusader channel. One of the things that concerns me about hate speech regulations and so on, and then creating safe spaces, and so-and-so is Catholic, and therefore I know he must hate me, and that becomes a hostile work environment, and then you get, human resources offices involved, and you get in this very tremendous tangle. There has to be a way of advancing the conversation soberly. So I like your natural law approach. For example, you were talking with people with same-sex attraction. I said, hey, let's talk about bodies and how they're similar and how they're different and how they fit and what happens when they fit and what happens when they don't. And then you can actually go really far by dealing with the obvious and without people appearing to be threatened. Now, part of me is impatient and just wants to drop the truth bombs, but I agree with long term, that doesn't get you hearing. I think back to a student I had when I was teaching rhetoric, and she said she wanted to give a presentation in what she imagined would be a hostile environment. She wanted to talk about natural marriage to a group advocating same-sex marriage. And she started off with, my only goal is to be invited back. And it was a really brilliant speech, and she stayed on message, but she did it in a way that didn't generate animosity. Is this where our Lord's exhortation to be wily as serpent and innocent as doves comes into play?
Yeah, it must. And St. Paul has precedent for this. When he's speaking to the Areopagite and he talks about the unknown God, essentially he's appealing to their, let's say, flawed but on the right trajectory sort of philosophical mindset where they understood there was some sort of uncreated creator. He wasn't saying, hey, look, this is the pagan God. What he's saying is that thing that you're feeling, that thing that you're grasping at, here's your solution to that. And this is what I think Dietrich von Hildebrand was so good at, using this sort of almost existential language and speaking in the language of the philosophers of our day in order to reach them. This is what I think Dostoevsky was so good at, using a similar type of almost psychological approach to talking about morality, because that's what people need to hear. I'm a traditional Catholic, whatever that means. So sure, if you want to come and talk to me about the Summa Theologica or something, yeah, I'll engage that conversation. But if I'm going to talk to my neighbor about that, he's going to look at me like I've got 10 heads.
Right.
So that's why men like Jordan Peterson have been so fascinating, is they take the psychological approach to what's moral and what's not. It takes a while. You might have to sit there and talk for an hour and a half,
right?
Because you've got to almost get to first principles. It's like, do you believe in reality or not? But once you do that, then truth is a very exhilarating experience for people. So it's kind of contagious, and once they hear it, they want to hear more.
Well, when I was teaching philosophy of God to undergrads, I found that most undergrads would immediately zone out if you talked about the merits of a cosmological argument versus an ontological argument for the existence of God. But everyone has an experience of an opinion about evil. So when I presented philosophy of God in terms of, hey, our very existence depends on a supreme being sustaining us moment by moment. And it looks like the problem of evil is sawing away at the limb that we're holding onto for dear life. That would get people's attention, and you got them to eat their broccoli without letting them know that it's broccoli. And Aristotle saw that, St. Ignatius saw that too, that, yes, you need to stay on message, but you don't start with, what do I want to say? You start with, who is my audience? What can my audience hear, understand, remember? And if you're really good, then you'll ask, what does my audience need? And in that small space, you can begin to focus on what it is that you want to say. Friends, when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Kennedy Hall. He's a Canadian Catholic author, hosts the Kennedy Report for the Fatima Center and the Kennedy Profession on the Crusader Channel. We're talking about Canada, church versus state. In the next segment, we're going to talk about signs of hope. I don't see them from where I'm sitting. I'm hoping Kennedy can enlighten me. Be part of the conversation. Follow what we're following by following us on Gab. That's gab.com. Our channel is The Catholic Current. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. Keep the conversation going, and together we'll take it around the world. We'll be back in just 2 minutes. Please do stay with us.
There's no better way to start your day than with spiritual formation from inspiring priests.
You can invoke the precious blood, invoking its power of protection and sanctification and intercession. For example, deliver me, O precious blood, from the sin of pride, from the sin of anger, from the sin of envy, from the sin of covetousness, from the sin of lust, from the sin of sloth, from the sin of gluttony.
That's Sermons for Everyday Living, weekdays from 6 to 7 a.m. Eastern on the Station of the Cross.
After today's broadcast, go to the Catholic Current show page on thestationofthecross.com for info on today's guests, the show resource links, and to sign up for our weekly email of upcoming shows.
Praise be Jesus Christ. This is Father Robert McTigg of the Society of Jesus, your daily host for the Catholic Current, where we bring Christ to the world and the world to Christ. You're listening to us from the Station of the Cross studios, your local radio station, and the iCatholic Radio mobile app, where we proclaim the fullness of truth with clarity and charity. Our topic today is this: Canada, church versus state. Our returning guest is Kennedy Hall, a Canadian Catholic author. He hosts the Kennedy Report for the Fatima Center and a new radio program, The Kennedy Profession, on the Crusader Channel. Kennedy, when I talk to you, I say, gosh, I have so much to learn about Canada. There's more there than just big empty space and a lot of hockey. And it's a very complicated story. We haven't talked very much about the French role and what French Catholic Canada plays in the history and the narrative. But here's what I have in mind. And I was told that French Catholic Canada was a model of a Catholic culture pervading civic life. And then in 1967-ish, one day somebody flicked a switch and it all disappeared overnight. It's a simplified version of the story, but I think it's reasonably accurate. And I asked people, well, how did that happen? And what do we learn from that? And I only get a shrug of the shoulders. Is there any place in Canada where Catholic life, you would say, is flourishing, confident, and not embattled?
Not in a region or province as a whole, but in various communities.
Okay.
Well, and we've talked about this off the air. I know it's controversial, but the SSPX is one of the only sort of traditional options here, and they've got some pockets throughout the country. There's some strong sort of diocesan situations in northern Alberta. They have a pretty strong Catholic presence up there. Some of the Ukrainian Catholic communities, because they keep hold of that because it's sort of the ethnic thing. Mm-hmm. And then the Francophone communities outside of Quebec held on to their faith stronger than the French did in Quebec, because almost as a sort of retaining their Frenchness was holding on to the faith. And then you have your various ethnic parishes or the Polish parishes and things, which tend to hold on pretty strongly compared to the rest. But just interestingly about Quebec, I have half a mind to write a book on a man named Maurice Duplessis. He is, in my opinion, he needs to be studied by all political actors who are Catholic in parliamentary presidential democratic systems, because he was able to run essentially what amounted to a Christian corporatist state, but in the province of Quebec without having an army. And he did so. He was such a pious and devout man that his second in command was, there should be a cause for his canonization. He actually died protecting the Eucharist in his home chapel as there was a fire. And he tried to get it out of the building and fell to the ground with the Eucharist underneath him. And he was burned to death, but he protected the Eucharist. I mean, that's the stuff of saints.
Oh my goodness.
And those were the type of men that Maurice Duplessis surrounded himself with. Mm-hmm. He was a devout man, extremely devout. And to this day, there's not a biography in English. So maybe I gotta write something about him, because he was amazing. And then after the council, I'm not blaming the council, it's too simplistic to do so. However, after the council, with contraception being okayed tacitly by the Canadian bishops, Quebec sort of commit spiritual suicide.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah, that you're referring to the Winnipeg statement, which was, suffice to say, squishy in terms of its response to Humanae Vitae. And as far as I know, it's never been rescinded. No one has ever said, oops, sorry, my bad, never mind. That's never happened, has it?
No, but it in and of itself, so it was a national synod of bishops. That actual statement was from a breakaway group of that national synod, and it was just a recommendation. It was not even the position of the bishops. So it was your classic sneaky media thing where they just sort of leaked it out and it said Bishop so-and-so, Canadian bishops, and then, contraception's fine. And it just sort of got away from them. Right.
Okay. And then people ran with it there. I think of my good Jesuit friend, Father Joseph Fessio, who said that nearly all problems can be solved by faithful Catholics having more children. And I think of Father Z, who says, no matter what you do, start by going to confession. Mm-hmm. I think both things are true. I think the hope is going to be forming small communities. And if you want to start a fire, you have to generate some kindling. I'm ambivalent about Rod Dreher's Benedict option. In fact, I have a manuscript under review at Ignatius Press right now, where it's more kind of a Jesuit looks at the Benedict option. But that having been said, what do you recommend? I have some friends who just got married this summer. There's a couple got married in June. There's a couple getting married in August. Very faithful, traditional, thoughtful Catholics in the United States. Given your Canadian experience, given what you have lived, what would you recommend for young Catholic couples who are just starting out?
Well, they could buy my book, Family Be Damned, talking about how the devil attacks the family.
Right.
But seriously, rightly ordered family. It's controversial. No one wants to preach on that when it's in the lectionaries about headship of husband and all that sort of thing. But a rightly ordered family, the devil hates it, which is why he attacks it so much. Sure. And that is how you defend yourself against the secularism that will try to creep its way into your home. Because St. Augustine tells us that peace is the tranquility of order. So if you have order in your home, you'll have peace in your home. So, if you have a crappy job and your boss is on your case and whatever, if you have peace in your home, then you have your refuge, you can be refreshed, you can be recharged, and you can stay that way. So I would recommend to a young couple getting married, embrace all of the dogmas of the church as far as openness to life, and do everything you can to have the rightly ordered home where you provide an opportunity for your wife to stay at home. And I promise you, I've been able to have 4 small children in a relatively short amount of time, 4 or 5 years. I'm an obscure Catholic author and a school teacher. I'm not a millionaire, but I tell you, the Lord provides, and we have never done as well as we have recently. And we work really hard to push that order in our household, and it's been the best thing we ever did for our marriage.
Could you tell us some more what you mean about a rightly ordered household?
Sure. So ideally speaking, you can read this in the Catechism of Trent, for example, that essentially a wife should like to stay at home and do the sort of traditional wifely things. Unfortunately, that's been co-opted by the, let's say, 1950s Mad Men stereotype of a home. Mm-hmm. The household economy is much more complicated than that. But what a rightly ordered home is, there's a spiritual headship of the husband. There's a mutual submission of both spouses as they understand each other as their ticket to heaven. They're the cross that they've decided to carry, so they sanctify one another through their marriage. But in the economics, the economy of the home, the governance of the home, there's one head, which is how, teams have one captain, governments have one president, and so forth. Right. But this is actually freeing to the rest of the people in the household because, I know from example, from being a coach, if I picked the right captain, the rest of my players would actually be able to perform freely. Whereas if I didn't pick the right captain, they would be fighting the whole time and they wouldn't even play their best. So if dad is in charge in the sense of spiritual head, working to provide for the family, formation, moral formation, then the wife doesn't have to worry about things that take away from her ability to nurture her children and to save her own soul. And it's completely controversial because it's anti-feminist and all that kind of stuff. But you will never regret taking that plunge where you do everything to have the rightly ordered home. Also because, God created us with natures, and Adam was created to till the garden and Eve was the helpmate. So another thing too is people say, oh, you're being anti-woman. No, listen, I'm advocating for men to have more responsibility and more acute understanding of where that should be, not less. So It's all well and good to say, oh, I want equality. No, what you want to do is you want to do less. How about you do more and do it in a way where you're intentional and motivated to do it properly? And then what you'll do is you'll give your wife the service she deserves, because we know from reading in St. Paul that the husband is like Christ to the family, which means you have to be prepared to die for it.
Right. Kenny, thank you for a splendid conversation. I look forward to another one soon.
Thank you.
I'm Jesuit Father Robert McTeigue. You want to join us tomorrow for a special episode of The Catholic Current. I'm going to have a new segment called Let's Talk About This. I'm going to offer a line-by-line refutation of a Washington Post article criticizing the Church's teaching on Holy Communion. After the broadcast today, go to thestationofthecross.com, get our resources list, download our audio as podcast. May the blessing of Almighty God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit descend upon you and remain with you forever. Go in peace. Please pray for me.
Thank you for listening to this podcast brought to you by thestationofthecross.com, a listener-funded nonprofit organization. If this podcast has helped you in your spiritual journey, please prayerfully consider donating at thestationofthecross.com by calling 1-877-888-6279 or through our free iCatholic Radio mobile app.